Welcome everyone to this webinar on the new Charity Governance Code. I'm Norman Blissett, I'm Director of Gallinack, and I'm delighted to have with me today Rosie Chapman. Rosie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Rosie Chapman. I'm the independent, in all senses of the word, chair of the Charity Governance Code. And what do I do the rest of my time? Well, I'm a trustee of a couple of charities, and I previously worked for Charity Commission for about 10 years as its Director of Policy, and these days I act as an advisor to charities when I'm not spending time on the Governance Code.
Thanks, Rosie. I'm delighted that you're able to join us for this webinar today. I'm really grateful we're going to get your insights from the inside as well on the new Governance Code. What I should say to all people who are watching the webinar is that we are able to answer questions. So if you want to put questions to us using the chat function on this webinar, then we'll see them come up and we'll answer them as we go along. So let's get going, Rosie. So you've been instrumental in designing this new Charity Governance Code. Tell us why it's important. Why should people be using it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my starting point is I do accept the fact that charity governance is not necessarily the sexiest or most glamorous subject that people are ever going to come across, and I think as well, I do think it's important to recognise that trustees don't join boards usually because they're interested in governance. It's usually because they're interested about the cause or they want to make a difference. But I do think if you are a charity and you've got charity status, there is a kind of badge of honour which goes with that because you're delivering a public benefit or a public good. And charities, I think, have a responsibility to kind of honour and treasure that public good that they're providing. And the board is acting as a custodian for that. I think the code is one way of demonstrating that they're being a good custodian of the attributes of a charity. I think there's other practical reasons in that if you put bluntly, a lot of the failures in charities in recent years have come down to governance.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was going to observe is the big scandals recently have been largely to do with governance.
I mean, you drill down and they usually come down to governance. And I think if you follow a code such as a Charity Governance Code, it's a good way of giving yourself good protection against kind of governance failings. But I don't want it to be used in a negative way. I do think it's a very positive tool for charities.
No, I completely agree with that. Is that you're right? It's not the sexiest of subjects, but absolutely essential that charities have that basic framework in place and ensure that they are working in not only in the spirit of it, but in the detail of it as well. So tell us a bit more about the code and what does it contain? What sort of features does it have?
Yeah, so well, we've been delighted that the code has been supported by the Charity Commission. I should say that up front. And the House of Lords, who recently published a report looking at charities' governance and sustainability, have also been really supportive of the code as well. I won't go into all the details of what's in the code because I suspect most people watching this webinar will be able to, who already have the code, or they'll be able to get access to it. It's on our website at, let me see if I can remember it, is charitygovernancecode.com. So go and click on there and you can find the code in detail. It sets out, it's very, if you've looked at other codes, it's very familiar. You'll see a lot of the wording that you'll find in other codes. So it uses 7 principles and they build on a foundation. And the foundation is basically saying that actually if you're a good trustee, you'll be committed to good governance, you'll be committed to properly understanding your role and responsibilities. So for example, read the Essential Trustee, and you'll be committed to the cause. So I think that's kind of self-evident. So if I was going to highlight some things that I think are important in the new code, one is, I would say, the emphasis of the board's role in providing effective leadership. There's a whole principle on leadership and there's a whole principle on board effectiveness. And the section on the board's role, it's not just a strategic role. Obviously that's important in thinking about the mission of the organisation and its future plans and sustainability, but also some of the practical things. And so we put in there about being aware of the commitment that's involved in being a board member and committing to the time that's going to be involved. In effect, I guess, not just rocking up to a meeting, but doing the paperwork.
Reading the papers.
Going on the site visits, those sorts of things. Another highlight is we place a lot of emphasis in the code in thinking about how the board can work effectively together, and it specifically has a recommendation that boards should set aside time once a year to have a conversation about how they work together and whether it could be improved. And one of the things that I think is interesting, some people might be aware of the corporate code, and some of the things that I'd highlight that are different about charity governance code and why I think it's a better code for charities to follow is that one, of course, it's aimed at not-for-profit organisations, and that is a difference in approach and status.
That's reflected in the language that's in there and the sort of issues that you addressed, that is very charity specific.
And the reality that most board members, the vast majority, are volunteers, and that does make a difference. But it also, the code works on the premise that most charities, they've got their policies and procedures, they're pretty okay at that. But the area for development is perhaps board behaviours and how boards work together. So there's a lot more emphasis on that, hence for example, the suggestion of the annual meeting or annual review. And the other big difference from the Code of Corporate Governance is the emphasis on having a board which has a diversity of thought. I don't just mean diversity in the narrow, characteristics of the Equalities Act, but people with a variety of backgrounds and interests, just so that you don't get an overly polite board or a kind of agreement all the time on everything.
I think that's a really good point, and something that I've tried to do when I've been a chair of trustees is make sure you get a mix of different personalities as well as backgrounds, because you want people in there challenging, you want people asking the difficult questions, but you also want the analysts in there as well that get into the detail and people that see the big picture. So getting that also feels important. We've got a question from Jonathan Waterfield. So Jonathan's question is, does Rosie have a top 3 tips on how to engage trustees with the code when they're not familiar with it yet? Open brackets, sadly, close brackets. I guess not that many trustees yet will be completely familiar with it. So some tips on how to engage trustees with the code.
Yeah, top 3 tips. I think it depends which charity you have. One of the things I find that is often really useful is that sometimes you'll have people who they'll be familiar with codes in another setting, which is why I think it can be quite good to say, look, there are some similarities here with codes in other settings. So, for example, if you've got a trustee that perhaps is also a school governor, there's governance codes that relate to school governors. If you've got someone who's a company director of a large company, they'll be aware of the corporate code. So I think that would be one of my tips. I think a second tip is not to bog people down too quickly with the absolute detail of the code. If it's completely new to the charity, I think it's worth, if you've got staff, perhaps staff encouraging a conversation with the board about why it's important, why it would be helpful for the charity, why it would be helpful for staff. So that's my second tip. Third tip, as to what I think would be useful. I think take people on a journey.
We, in the charity that I'm chair of just now, what we've done is we've highlighted trustees about the new code, so we've made people aware of it. I don't expect they will all have read it, although maybe 1 or 2 will have. But our governance committee is going to do a more detailed review of it. So we will, in our governance committee, self-assess on the various elements of the code, and then bring that back to board and have a debate in the board. So, if you like, you're taking a little bit of the onus away from trustees to read it all and self-assess themselves, but also making sure that they're engaged with that. But I'm sure there's a variety of different
No, I
ways.
think that's an excellent idea, because the other thing I wanted to say is that I am mindful that, you know, this mustn't become an industry and take up all the board's time. That at the end of the day, the board is there to help the charity deliver its activities, its services. It's not there. It doesn't exist just to examine its navel all the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I should, before we move on to the next next point, I should say that there's two forms of the code: one for smaller charities of under £1 million of income, and one for bigger charities. I think it's a really excellent split to make, because there are differences between the two. Okay, so you've talked about what it's about, and you've given a few tips there on how to engage people. So how should charities use it?
Yeah, so for a smaller charity, I think it is worth going through it, either if they've got a little committee or working party to go through it, or a brief session at a board meeting to go through it and see how they match up, and a kind of sense of where they think they're quite good and where there are gaps. And I would stress, I don't think for a smaller charity they need to make an industry of it, but I think it's just a helpful tool. And I've noticed if people look at my Twitter feed, at Rose Chapman 1, they'll find some examples of charities who've adopted it, and some are using a template or a little checklist that they're using. But it's interesting, some of the early adopters are small charities. So for larger ones, I think actually definitely using a checklist might be useful, but not necessarily presented to the board. I think, you know, if say you're a larger charity and if you're lucky enough to have governance support, I think you probably find it helpful to go through and see how you match up. And there will be gaps. And then to have a conversation at board level about, well, what are our priorities? If you're not going to be able to, those areas that you're not currently applying the recommended practice, don't try and sort it out all at once. It will be a journey. I'm not saying, I think, you know, for some charities they're probably there or thereabouts already. For others there will be gaps. So for example, there's a section in the code which talks about diversity and doing a report on how the charity is meeting the kind of diversity of its board and its leadership and meeting its diversity objectives, and having a short report on that. And some charities have said to me, well, we're really keen on this, but we're not quite sure how we're going to go about that. We'd really like some guidance on that. So that might be something that some charities might not prioritise, where there might be other things that they want to, that would be easy to change.
And the design of the code, the way that it's written and laid out, it is almost in the form of a checklist, so it's relatively straightforward to go through and to self-assess. So what practically, how should charities self-assess? Should they be giving themselves marks, or, you know, is it fully compliant, nearly there, or long way to go on each of the steps? So how would you suggest that they go about it?
I wouldn't use the word compliant, because I've got
I can see you take a bit of a step back there when I used the word, so apologies.
Well, it's partly because it's not a regulatory tool and it's not attached to funding. So, but I know what you mean. I think, there'll be some areas where, I think charities will have their own way of doing it. Most of those who've sent me examples are just using a text. So they're sort of saying, applying the code, or applying the recommended practice, or they're saying not applying the recommended practice because we do X, Y, and Z instead, or another would be not applying, and over the next period we will be doing whatever it is to meet this aspect of the code. But I did want to stress that it is apply or explain. You don't have to apply all aspects of the code. So, for example, some charities have said, well, the 9-year term limit for board members doesn't really work for us. Well, if there's a good reason why it doesn't, you can explain why not.
Okay, time is nearly running out,
Oh, sorry.
unfortunately. Just one very quick last question, which is that only a handful of charities will look at that and think, yeah, we're there at all points. Most charities will have gaps. Some charities will have big gaps. So what is the point at which a charity should be concerned about how they are operating, and what should they do about it?
Right. I think a charity should be concerned if they're not interested in either this code or a similar code, and there are other codes out there. For example, you know, if you're a sports charity, you're probably better off following Sport England's governance code. But I do think if you're not following a code at all, that's a problem. I think if the board are blinkered, that's a problem. If I was going to focus on an area, I would look in particular at the board effectiveness section, and perhaps look at that section and those recommended practices first.
Okay. And work on those as the priorities first.
Yeah, I think so. Because if you're doing that, then a lot of the other things will follow. I think I'd.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rosie, for that insight. I think that's certainly been very helpful for me, from my understanding, but I hope for everyone else that's been watching. So thank you to everyone for joining the webinar, and thank you to Rosie for joining us.
Thank you for organising it, Norman. It's great. Thanks.